Right, welcome everybody. This is the first call about the architecture design workflow, the effort that we're doing about the new diffs. If anybody has any better naming, please suggest, because we're really bad at this. But let's start away with a little bit of an introduction. Phil, I'll ramble and I'll speak, but if you feel like something's missing, please cut me off and fill in. So why are we here? So in the past couple of years, we've been trying to iterate with. It's not how you write iterate. Somebody can take notes. It would be great. Trying to iterate on the current MR diffs architecture, and we've been. I'm going to stop. And we've been hitting some snags about how far along can build application, performance-wise, maintainability-wise. And we just keep having different kinds of diffs in the application. We have the merge request diffs, and we have the repository diffs, and we have the compare view diffs between branches, and we have the new merge request. So there's a bunch of like separate implementations of the diffs that live elsewhere. The more we talk about these things, it feels like we're taking the current architecture as far as we can with getting things from GitLab, caching in the database, pushing it to the front end in multiple batches, the front end rendered with a whole tree of view components, still with Vuex, but it feels like we have iterated a lot, added virtual scrolling, knowing that it was a temporary solution, introducing a couple of side effects that weren't desired, like user can't search the whole diffs, right? The reason why we're here is we want to try to build an architecture design document that will envision the future of diffs at GitLab. And we're explicitly avoiding calling this the merge request because it's not, it's diffs. One of them will be the merge requests. The other will be the repository compare page. And anywhere where the diff comes up, we can have a tool built for that. So that's why we have source code, code review, GitLab present, and backend and front end of those two teams. We don't have any particular done decision yet. So there's a lot of discovery that is going to be having to go through. But we count on everybody here. And even those who are watching the recording, we count on everybody to help steer the way and help author this design document. So that's why we're here. Is that clear for everybody? Anybody has any questions? Did I miss anything, Phil? Awesome. So what are we trying to accomplish? A design document covering the architecture from start to finish, which would be, I don't know, from Git to browser, to support a better way of doing diffs. Let's keep it generic at this point. We'll cover a little bit more detail down the bottom. So that's the goal of this effort. We don't intend to ship code for production as part of this effort. Is the design document is the or the documentation is the outcome of this effort. Later, we'll definitely plan out the implementation of these guidance. But for now, all our focus should be on drafting a document that we can all attest that is covering all scenarios, all needs that we have on our side of the equation. Right, any questions there? Cool. Okay. DRIs, just covering that a little bit. We have already identified the DRIs, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the expectations for the DRI. Everyone can contribute. I'll remind everyone of this. I'll remind everyone of this mantra that is definitely real here. It's not just the DRIs that will contribute. Everybody's welcome to contribute. The DRIs are essentially, in the case of we're having a discussion that we need further input from the team, but the team is not aware, the DRIs will make sure to loop them in. They'll try to make every calls we're having, or if not, at least watch the recording and bring up any potential other discussions to the relevant people. Say, for example, just off the top of my head, I know that Robert May is really knowledgeable about caching. If we're discussing about a topic of caching, but Robert is not present, I count on Igor to loop him in because he's in his team, and that would be just a great way to keep the topics directed to the right experts. In case the DRIs can't make the call, just make sure that somebody from your team makes it. That's kind of it. And if you can't make it, nobody can make it, at least watch the recording and participate asynchronously in the discussions. Right. Is that clear in terms of expectations, DRIs? Right, this is like the Andrea show. Right, so DRIs covered. So goals, let me try, I've given some thought to this, but so again, create the document for the architecture. And then we also need to, we're brainstorming now, so please, if you can think of something that I'm not covering, please speak up. And the other thing that we know for sure is needs to cover all scenarios where diffs are used around GitLab. Right now, we have identified a few. I don't think there's more, but so there's a lot of reusability will be part of this effort. So we don't know exactly where it's going to be used, but we need to prepare it for reusability anywhere it needs. So cover all scenarios. Anybody has any?
What's the scope of the word diffs in this context? Because if it can be reused anywhere, that to me means like, oh, it's a component that can render a diff, but we could also be talking about like the entire diffs app. So what are we trying to scope out here that can be reused everywhere?
Anybody has any thoughts on that?
I guess it probably makes sense to go the side of a diff that can be used anywhere rather than being specific in the diffs merge requests or commits or whatever. I can just take this component, give it a diff, and it can just render it essentially. Would be nice.
So, okay, so just so that we're on the same page, are we talking about basically our goal here is to be able to render any diff in a component that we can share across the whole application? Is that sort of the idea of this like new diffs sort of thing? We wouldn't be reworking like any of the other parts of the diffs app. We wouldn't be reworking. I don't know. It would just be a component that renders a diff. Is that better for everyone?
let me step in there. You're correct in part that the diffs app has a lot of stuff that are not relevant for every diff. However, a collection of diffs is a diff. A file tree to navigate the collection of diffs, because if you think about it, if you think of a diff conceptually in Git, you might have more than one file. You have a long path with multiple files. That's part of the diff that we want to render it, and it's relevant for commits. It's relevant for comparing branches, and we can keep it scoped on the Git diff. What's a Git diff? It's like all the information that's present in the Git diff, everything around it. So, for example, in the merge request would be all the options related to the merge request itself, like the header and all that stuff. It's not present on the diffs, but the way it's presented inline or parallel should be accounted for, at least the presentational part. However, the way you worded it, it's a very front-end code review scope, which is fair because that's where you live. But behind this component, we need to potentially change a few things on how the diff gets to the browser to make it performant, to make it fast. So one of the things we had talked about already is performance not being degraded regardless of how big the MR is. That's kind of like an overall thing. The number one complaint we hear from product and customers, I talked to Kai yesterday about this, is the speed of the diffs. I can't review my 5,000 changes MR or my 5,000 files changed MR. So we want to make sure that whatever we build should be built with performance in mind from the day one. From the moment we get data from Gitly, we need to account for performance optimizations. So the user doesn't see the diff entirely right away. The way we've been iterating on the past couple of years is we batch it. We render the first batch first, push that to the browser, render that, and then continue to progressively render the rest. But the way we get the data from Gitly and the way we started in Rails might not be prepared for that, might not be optimized for that. We can probably have some clever ways of doing it a little bit differently. If not, perfectly fine. But we'll, in this part of the effort, we'll reassess all of these parts to see, is there any way that we can do it better? So the scope is rendering a diff, allowing the user to customize the way it sees the diff, because preferences are relevant. But it's much more deeper than that. It goes back to all the way down to Gitly and the way we get the information from that side. Is that clear? Is that fair? Sorry, you might disagree with me.
Does it mean that we're going to increase the limits that we currently have, or we're going to remove them?
Sorry,
right
what was that, Patrick? I didn't get the question.
Does it mean that we're going to increase the limits that we currently have, or remove it completely? Is that a goal?
You're talking about the application limits, right?
Yep. Yeah, the diff limits.
The application limits were designed to fit the current way we deliver diffs to the browser. I would say that we could think about it and potentially, I think we're probably going to need to think about a way to build this on the side of what we have. So we're probably going to be, new endpoints, new APIs kind of thing. And we might have different application limits there, whatever makes sense to keep the stability of the platform. So I would say yes, but I think it's up to us to test those limits. If they're working, we should keep it. And if they're not working, we should revise them.
I think part of this issue here is also really the Gitly API that we provide from our side, because currently, as you already said, the API that Gitly provides is not really ideal when it comes to rendering this, because we don't really provide an incremental way to give you, for example, this for only parts of an MR, for example. And this is something where I feel like we in the Gitly team should really iterate on our current API design and make this better so that we can support your needs in a better way.
Yeah, I agree, Patrick. Thank you. I think it's important to be aware that at this moment, we're not accounting for level of effort. That comes later, okay? If we think about all the work that needs to get done for this, it's a lot of work. But we're not going to stop ourselves right away to just do the simplest things. We want something that gets to the goal, and then we'll plan the implementation around that as we go forward. But for now, everything is up for revision. And it's up to us later. Like that's a future problem, a future selves problem. Thanks, Patrick. I think that's pretty spot on.
And, just a quick question, just for clarification. I had an impression that this new Diffs initiative, it's like we already have like merge request diffs, commit diffs, and it's like it works perfectly, but it's not so performant and not so scalable. And we want to have it like to work. Have it work faster. Yeah, but after this discussion, I have an impression that it's not the case. Yeah, we just want to improve like the quality, and it doesn't mean that it's only performance and only scalability. Yeah, we like considering all the aspects of diffs. Or correct me if I'm wrong.
That's a really interesting question with a really vague answer in my part, because it's really to be defined. And I'll give you an example. What we like, the current implementation of diffs satisfies a need, presenting the diff to the users, right? However, as we're iterating towards a new solution, there might be opportunities to solve long-running problems. And I'll give you an example. Right now, every comment is attached to a line, and a line exists on a revision of a merge request or a branch comparison or something. which gets trickier because on the merge requests, we're constantly comparing to the moving target, the moving head of the target branch, right? The patches might be the same. We have some patch ID work in flight and everything, but we're attaching it to the line, right? We have a bunch of ideas and features that rely on being able to leave comments on things other than the line. For example, a commit message. Why shouldn't the reviewer be able to comment on the commit message? There's other things like instead of commenting on a line, why not be able to comment on a code object? And if you think about an if clause, a for loop, if you can attach the comment to that structure of code, if somebody adds lines at the top, the comment should still apply to the structure if that's unchanged. And we've seen some competitors doing this, like code review specific tools. So here's how I reframe it to this effort to answer your question. We might think of a way to rethink the addressability of comments on a diff. Is it attached to a line, or is it attached to a vague object that has some sort of URI that allows us to resolve the location of it, right? If we do that work now in this effort, design a way to like an address format, which is sort of like a URL for comments on diffs, we should be able to later on build these new features going beyond the diff line. But for now, we're just talking about the architecture for what we currently have to satisfy those needs. It doesn't stop us from thinking about what doors we could open for the future. That's why it's an architecture effort where we're thinking about the future, but we're targeting, if anything, if to answer a little bit more directly, feature parity would be okay. Like if we have a way to render diffs that gets what we have today, I think that's a success. If we can go beyond that, that's amazing. But we should always account for example, the comments should be able to leave suggestions on the diffs. Because that we have that today. Now, does that apply to merge requests only, or does that apply to the repository as well? That's part of the conversations we'll be having along the way. Long-winded answer. Does that add any clarity, Igor?
Yeah, thanks for the answer. So then I would suggest, and one of the action items is gathering all the existing issues and ideas that we have already in one place. In case, unless you want like to have a fresh start, and gather new ideas and then compare them to the old ones. But maybe let's have the old ideas so we could like see the problems that we need to solve, or by our new architecture. Yeah, thank you.
That's fair. I added a note here to the immediate task that we'll talk about in just a second. Yes, I think you're right. I think that is something that will be, for example, we know this because we've been working on this on the code review side of things, but I don't expect, Patrick from Gitaly or you from source code to know about what we've been talking about on the product side of code review. For sure, that's definitely going to be part of the tasks. I'm just checking. Okay, so it's just a 50-minute call, so we have a bit more, like 30 minutes. Okay, what else? That's the scope. Can we move on from the scope? Is that clear for everybody? Awesome. So then in terms of objectives, like performance not being degraded regardless of how big the MR is, I feel like that's clear for everybody, having some sort of progressive ways of getting data, rendering data, caching, all that stuff. That's good. And this means different things for each one of us. For the front end, it means that we'll have to find ways so that the front end architecture is not compromised when the MR starts to get large. Any other objectives that we should keep in mind?
I have a quick question, but feel free to let me know that we should discuss it later at some point. Regarding the highlighting on the front end, sorry, I haven't tracked this initiative, but I remember that we developed some part of it. Just wanted to know at which stage we are. Is it like fully rolled out, or do we have any blockers?
Jack, do you want to talk about that?
Are you referring to the syntax highlighting of the blobs?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a separate initiative, I think. Like the syntax highlighting of the blobs, like the highlight.js that we use there doesn't really do diffs as far as I'm aware. And it's also separate screens as well. Like viewing a blob is not related to viewing a specific commit or comparing it to a different commit. It's a separate page.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I feel like that's exactly right. We've been taking some lessons from that. It was a nice experiment, but rendering a blob is different than rendering a patch. And we've noticed that it can lead to incorrect highlighting. However, I think it's important to keep in mind the lessons there, because if we accept the imprecision of the highlight as an acceptable cost, we can try it. So that's, again, at the moment, we don't think that will be applicable, but if anybody has any other thoughts on that, where we could defer the highlighting to the front end, or we can pre-render it in some ways, all of that is valid. And a part of this gathering existing issues and potential proposals, I know that Carrie, you had previously proposed something like do more of pre-calculation of the data that we need to render the diffs. I think we're going to need to revisit that at some point. So let's make sure that those issues are created and documented, at least, and highlighted here in this effort. I don't know, we'll have let's create an epic. Or epic. We don't want to move them from the current epics. Let's create an issue and document them all there. Okay, I'll assign that task in just a bit to somebody. Does that make sense, Carrie, of like bringing that thing back? Okay. Highlighting on the front end. Okay, does that satisfy your question, Igor?
Yeah. And if I have half a minute, I can explain why I actually asked
Sure.
it. Because when I think about performance of the diffs, I remember that we do something like, for example, we have a diff for a file, and currently we fetch the old version of the diff, old version of the whole blob, and the new version of the whole blob, just to highlight the diff correctly. Why do we do historically? Just because we want the diff to be correct, because sometimes it's context related. Yeah, for example, you have a string opened like 10 lines somewhere higher, behind the diff, and we still want to highlight it correctly. So yeah, I believe if we start discussing performance improvements of the diffs, these are the questions that we probably will be often try to solve and find like the new trade-offs. So yeah, it's something that we can discuss later, but yeah, a lot of trade-offs will be involved. So yeah, one of the examples.
I was doing like front-end highlighting in the little Diffs like micro app that I wrote. That was the exact problem that I ran into. I never actually saw incorrect highlighting, but the flaw was there where if we didn't have the whole blob, it could have highlighted incorrectly because of what you said, 30 lines up, something happened that changed the highlighting. If we have to fetch the whole blob anyway, in my opinion, front-end highlighting allows us more flexibility because we can wait until the user scrolls to near the file to highlight it. But like you said, there's a lot of trade-offs because now you've got to deliver the whole blob to the front end. So
the way I envision this, and if you have better ideas, this is like, please propose, is that as the discussions evolve, we're probably going to have big topics in specific calls to be discussed and also be discussed asynchronously. As we go, we'll pick these topics and we'll broadcast them all. Like, let's have a discussion on the syntax highlighting. Let's have a discussion on caching. Let's have a discussion on those things, because we're going to need some help in figuring out some of the possibilities, because there's a bunch of possibilities on how do we want to address this, but we need to come with a choice or some choices for the architectural design. So this will be one of them. syntax highlighting is going to have to be part of it. Okay, thanks, Igor. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Jack. And Carrie. Moving on, one of the things that we have already talked, and I talked to Paulina about this, is we know that accessibility isn't the best today on the merge request diffs or diffs overall, because we haven't paid too much attention to that. Since we're rethinking a lot of this as a quality usability improvement, it will be really good if you start incorporating accessibility from the start. So how should we word this, Paulina? Is it accessible?
Yeah, accessible diffs. Yeah. So I started the document already. I'll be doing the audit of diffs now and analyzing what's missing right now. But also the second part will be looking at the guidelines that we should actually follow for the authoring tool, and rethinking a bit how we want to show or present the diffs to screen reader users. For all the other parts, it's small tweaks for tab navigation and things, but for the screen reader, it's a bit tricky because what we show is very graphic right now, and we need to be able to, for the screen reader to read it, compute it with the relations between the number of lines, the code changed, and all the extra features like commenting.
Right. So in terms of accessibility is such a wide concept and term. When we're talking about specific, making it a bit more specific, we can narrow it down to screen reader users, keyboard navigation. I
would also add how to phrase it. So visually, it's as easy to read for everyone.
Visually comfortable, is that?
Sort of contrast, size. If you use tooling magnifiers, so we don't lose context with.
So contrast, color blindness. So Fitts law is about, in a nutshell, is the larger the target it is, the easier it is to acquire. So make it comfortable for people with some motion disabilities and stuff. So again, if anything, this will be leveraged by the designers that we'll be bringing in at a later stage. But as we're thinking about the front end architecture, we should account for that.
Yes, it's designers, but also for screen readers especially, there's also HTML structure that needs to be very specific.
Exactly. I just wanted to remind that we're not going to be writing code right away, but when we're designing the document, that should be there as a requirement. It's something that we need to be accounting for. So that's the expectation level. Great. This is good. Thanks. Anybody has any other thoughts about accessibility? Cool. I feel like it's positive that we're talking about it at this stage of the project. Thomas, you have a point here.
Yeah. So we can kind of fold accessibility into this. As part of my milestone stuff, I review all my assignments. I was assigned a meta task for new diffs, so it's weird that I reviewed it because it's a meta task, but I wrote some thoughts down. And one of them is writing down documents about budgets and data flow. And when I talk about budgets, implicit in that is our promises to users, essentially. And I think one of those things should be accessibility. But other things are, how heavy on the network is this new structure of diffs? How heavy on a user's browser is this new application or new component or whatever? How much code is executed? How long does it take? Those kinds of things. Setting those budgets early and saying, whatever we do has to be fully accessible to fully blind people or fully deaf people or whatever. Setting those early sets expectations for the whole work that we do. So I think that should be an early part of this documentation, not just the architecture, but what are the difficult choices that we will accept for the benefit of our users. And I linked my review that has a few of those things in there. But
Great, thanks, Thomas. I particularly like the budget documents. The data flow we already like, you'll be part of, I think, the documentation anyway, but the budget document is something that we can easily forget. And when we're deciding about adding a new thing, because you're right, like we don't want to build something that is performant on the day 1 and then on day 365, oh my God, it's slow again. Why? Yeah, definitely something to keep us in check. And potentially we can even talk about linting to like adding linting tools, CI checks, etc. Definitely makes sense to keep us in line.
Yeah, I guess I should probably note somewhere, we should note that the word budget is intentional because budgets are reviewed quarterly or yearly, and if you're not meeting them, you adjust to meet your budget. So we should make sure that we're continually doing this, not just as an initial target.
Got it. Thanks. Okay, so there was one thing that has been throughout all these discussions that we haven't talked yet, which is maintainability. One of the problems we faced with working with Diffs is that the application itself is so complex that over time, the maintainability of the app just suffers. And especially with an iterative approach or building things based off boring solutions, and then eventually we can just keep it at that stage for a really long time. We have plenty of examples for sure. But yes, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is an improved, or at least improved maintainability than what we have today. And I think, does anybody disagree with that being a goal? Let's put it that way.
You want to spend the next 20 minutes defining maintainability?
I thought you were going to say, do you want to kick the person who says yeah? No. I mean, sure. What do we like? I think we have maybe I have an idea of what maintainability is, but should we take a stab at like defining that roughly? Or do we just keep it vague at the moment and we...
I think it has to be defined at some point. I don't know if this is the point to do it, but we do have to have that conversation. There has to be a metric, or we're never going to do it. It's just, yeah, if we can't measure it, what can we do?
All right, so let's open an issue to do that asynchronously. Move to an issue to iterate on a joint definition of maintainability. Feels like we're moving in a W3C standard where we have like, what does must mean? What does should mean? And that's good. That's a positive thing, fellas and gals, because I think that's how we get the standard to live on without misinterpretation along the way. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up. Let's move that to an issue. I'll put here then at the bottom, create issue to define maintainability. Cool. All right. Any other goals that we should keep in mind? So let's recap. So create a document for the architecture, which is the main goal. We need to cover all scenarios where diffs are used around GitLab. We need performant. We need to keep it performant. Oh, sorry. I should read the rest of the phrase. Performance not being degraded regardless of how big the diff is. See, it's going to happen a lot of times. It's not MR. It's not MR. It's diffs. Accessible app for the users. We'll need to define boundaries and user first promises, which is documents for budget, documents for data flow, and potentially like targets for linting, and an improvement in ability than what we have today. Anything missing from objectives?
How about metrics, like performance metrics, usage metrics?
How should we, so what's the target there?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I don't know. I mean, we have guidelines for performance metrics because we have targets, right, for backend and front-end response times. So that's one. But
Okay,
for
yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. But for usage metrics, I'm not sure.
I think I'm going to channel my Stanislav because he's sick, so I'm going to pull him in, and I'm going to be speaking as if I was him. Because we've talked about this in the past, and I think Thomas as well, is to not pursue vanity metrics. What does this mean? If we think about the usual metrics we have, which is time to first byte, I don't know, LCP and TBTs and all that stuff, a lot of those metrics can have. It was you, Thomas. Yes, that's blurry. So there you go. No, you're like a YouTuber. Look at that. Like, look at my thing. So yeah, the point of that is we should pursue meaningful metrics. I think that's how we can word it. And what's meaningful is meaningful for our project, which means we're probably going to need to define those metrics. And one of them falls into what Thomas was talking about, the budget documents, right? Is things specifically built for us. Because I can give you an example. We had major improvement on TBT recently, but that came at a cost of some usability, right? And it was conscious. We knew what we were doing, but what I think we need to think a little bit deeper about is why do we want to move those metrics and what's the impact of that to the user? So, which goes a little bit to my next point of ordered priorities. We're going to grab all these goals and we're going to put them in order, and like what's the most important thing first, and then if we have to make a choice between some of those. So for example, if we need to sacrifice accessibility for performance, should we? Right? And I think having an order of priorities definitely helps later on in the project. W3C does this with the HTML5 spec, where it specifies exactly who comes first. Like users comes first, then comes authors, then comes browser implementers, and then comes speccers or whatever, or theoretical purity. So there's some priority order there. So for us, and a little bit more reasonable, I don't want to sacrifice accessibility, but if you think about more of perceived performance or meaningful metrics, like we're talking about here, meaningful metrics versus maintainability. I think we should probably sacrifice maintainability a little bit if that comes with some benefit to the perceived performance or to the meaningful metrics. So if anything, metrics to this point, I would just add meaningful metrics. And in parentheses, Thomas will put not vanity. Does that make sense, Patrick?
Yeah, makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. I agree.
Okay.
I think as part of our documentation process, we should define something like the W3C, like who comes first or what comes first. Obviously, users, right? And then like, what does that mean? So like performance, accessibility, what's the order of how we sacrifice things? I'll say it since it's not popular in the front end industry. Developers should be last. Our experience should be last. The DX should not be important. So
I'm going to grab this recording when later you're complaining about a bug that is really hard to fix. I'm like, hey, listen.
Yeah.
Look at this, old friend.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think it's just, yeah, we've lived through many hard problems to solve to know they come at a cost, but yeah. Cool. So I wrote meaningful metrics. Thanks, Patrick. Again, we're probably going to need to be defined. Create issue, I guess. Create issue for meaningful metrics. And we can use some things that we've used in the past, which is custom defined, what do we call it? The telemetry API that we have on the browser that we can user markings. You can have markings on the front end that like define stages of the render of the application, which include the performance of the backend and the front end all at once. We can define those things and implement it at the front end in terms of that, which doesn't exclude having other metrics for the backend exclusive, other metrics for GitLab and all that stuff. So that's why this is going to be a joint effort, because this might mean different things for each one of us. So we'll keep you all in the loop. All right. Anything else in terms of objectives? So we have 7 minutes. Before I go to ordered priorities, I'll ask, should we have also an issue to discuss I'll list all the goals of the things that we have defined above. Should we have an issue to discuss this asynchronously with everyone? Because I don't think we're going to be making a consensus here on the call. We can take a step of an example of what that would look like, but then everybody could go in that issue and then participate in defining that together. Does that sound good? We can have just an example of what it would look like, and then just discard that, and we go at it and build our suggestions in the issue. Sounds good? All right. So it's going to go. So, okay. So create the document is not a priority because that's just the task, right? So coverage of Diffs scenarios. And we can discard it later if it doesn't make sense. And then it's performance. That accessible users improved. Could probably find better words for this later. Maintain ability. What we talked about. Oh, we skipped one. How should we call your point, Thomas? Define boundaries and user first promises early. Is that part of the relevant metrics, meaningful metrics? Can we keep it in there?
Yeah, it's part of it for sure. There are also, I think it's also just like define, it's like defining deliverables, right? Like something is not complete if it's not accessible. It's not complete if it takes a full second to get the code for it across the network or whatever. So it's like, what are acceptable deliverable sort of boundary? Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's, if we frame it, I think that's part of the meaningful metrics. We define the meaningful metrics, and in there will be compliance with the budget. In there would be time to get the data from GitLab, or time to get the data from the Rails side, or anything like that. I think we can keep it for now covered with the meaningful metrics. So we have coverage of all Diffs scenarios, which goes, we can put it at odds with some particular scenarios that don't make sense. Performance regardless of diff size, which is part of meaningful metrics. Should we erase that?
Yeah, I think so.
So we're gonna have
our performance budget should work no matter what.
So coverage of these scenarios, accessible, improvement in ability, meaningful metrics, which is performance, I guess, as a whole. Okay. Oh, we missed one. Can we create a shared documents folder with some organization to start keeping our artifact in one spot?
This wasn't. I didn't vocalize it because this is
carried
fine.
on.
But like we can't work exclusively in issues, right? Because an issue is like something that eventually is closed or resolved. Where are we going to keep things? Should we create a wiki? Should we use our wiki feature? How are we going to do this? Or just Google Docs?
I've never been involved in an architecture design workflow. If anybody has, please, maybe Patrick or Carrie, you were. I was thinking about just using we're going to start to put things in the documentation itself of the architecture design. There's already a status for like proposed, accepted, that sort of thing. So we should not reinvent the wheel and just use the documentation as a living spec. As we go, we take it through the stages. I think that's what makes more sense. Anybody disagrees? Does that make sense?
How about the things that would not go into documents? Like if I'm doing the audit, it's not going to end up all there.
Sure.
So should I just keep that Google Doc?
I mean, we definitely can find a Google Drive folder to keep things organized.
Yeah.
I think that's okay. Like artifacts of investigations, sure. Maybe that can cover what Thomas was saying. But in terms of like, we should keep in mind that the effort should be to update the documentation that we're putting out. And if, like, for example, if it makes sense to reference the audit that you did, you can keep it in a Google Doc, but link it on the living spec, link it on the documentation that we're merging.
Okay.
But still, let's build a Google Drive just for
Yeah, I think we should have a Google Drive maybe for like drafts or like, hey, I'm doing this audit and here's a bunch of stuff. But if we're going to be linking like data or like report results, we should probably be using GitLab. So like, that's why I suggested Wiki. Like that can maybe we can store larger artifacts over in the Wiki and then link it from the documentation. I'm not sure, but
we can go. We can check that as we go. I think that
Google Drive necessarily means it's like private and we're keeping it a secret. And maybe we should default to something more public.
not necessarily. You can have Google Docs that are public. You can have a public version.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
but
we could be wrong.
it's the pattern of use, though. It really is like Google Docs is like, yeah, it's kind of hidden enough to the side.
Anyway, shouldn't we use GitLab? We should use GitLab, right?
Hey, I have an idea. Let's use GitLab.
Oh, okay.
All right, let's talk about it on Slack, and whatever people are agreeing, I don't have a problem with. Okay, so let's not take any actions. Let's discuss this thing. Thomas, you start the discussion on Slack, or on a GitLab issue. Sorry, because we need to talk through. Okay, so looking at the immediate tasks at hand. Looking at the ordered priorities, which we need to move to an issue. So what I think would do is like ordered. An example would be like meaningful metrics. Comes before then maintainability. So that would be the first choice. Accessibility should also come before maintainability. Coverage for all diff scenarios. That's a tricky one, but I'm just giving an example. Like you don't have to agree with that. I would say so we can keep it coverage because it needs to be accessible, but some things might not cover all scenarios. Maintainability. What's missing? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So this would be an example of to start off with. We might have different things that we add in as we go, but at least we'll have a place to document it, and this will be part of the documentation. Just an example. Let's move the discussion to an issue. Okay. Cool. And that takes me. We're over time. So I need people to claim these immediate tasks at hand. We need some people to start opening the MRs for the documentation just to get it started as a draft or whatever the status is. And I need someone to claim that task. I need someone to create the issue to gather all the existing issues. And that's the point is we create the issue, but then you broadcast it to everybody to add comments to that issue or something, or add to the description. An ask, what happened? Something changed. Oh, you added a comment. The document current approach for multiple diffs. We're probably going to need multiple. My Google Doc crashed. So the document current approach for multiple diffs implementations is that like we don't have a lot of visibility on how things happen between Gitly, like we on the front end, between Gitly and Rails. We don't have a lot of visibility on how things on source code happen on backend and stuff. So it would be nice to get some sort of like quick snapshot of how the diffs are being generated and handled today. I would keep it light-ish because this is just to understand where we are. It's not the outcome. It's just a good effort of capturing where we have today. And for this, what I would leverage is potentially grab all the DRIs and assign an issue to them. Why is my Google Doc? My Google Doc just crashed, which is why we should use GitLab. So I'll take action on that. I'll create an issue and I'll assign every DRI there, and potentially I'll ping you too, Patrick, because of Gitly. And the idea is just to share some notes or some diagrams of how we're doing the diffs today in your part of the organization, if that makes sense. Is that sensible for everybody, or am I missing something? Okay, sometimes I'm afraid that I'm making no sense at all. You're just too respectful to call me out. Let's assume it's not that. Right, I'll take that one. Document take that as for me. And then we need one, we already have one for the defined maintainability. Then we need one to create issue for meaningful metrics, and then an issue to discuss order of priorities. I can take that one too. So please take them on, assign yourself here, like we're doing, like me and Thomas. And then we know exactly who's going to take them, and then broadcast them on the Slack channel. I think that's the best way at the moment to get everybody that is involved or wants to be involved aware. That's it. Anybody has any other questions before we go? We'll talk about the sync calls scheduling on Slack or something, because like we don't have any time now.
Do we have is there a specific Slack channel for this? Am I in it? I don't know.
Ooh, F new diffs, right, Phil?
Yep.
Please join if you're not there.
Look at that. I'm not a member. Go ahead and join that.
You are now. All right.
Sweet.
Thanks, everybody. There's going to be a lot of discovery and a lot of crazy chaos through here, but I think it's great that we're having this conversation today. We see so many different scopes represented. So really appreciative of all of your time. And if you, by any chance, need some help prioritizing work to this with your managers, feel free to reach out to me, and I can try to put in a good word. Okay, that's it. We'll discuss asynchronously, and we see you on the ether or something. Bye. Have a great week.